Hello, Euro nerds, and welcome to our third and final installment in this section of notes, The Age of Exploration and Colonialism. This section here is going to take us from the beginnings of the Atlantic slave trade and then cover all the way to different European countries conquering different parts of the world and seeing where their empires are expanding, and also looking at which countries really dominate the world sphere, because that also shifts hands. So, here we go. All right, so the origins of the Atlantic slave trade already mentioned in the previous puzzle, and that all involves the Portuguese. So first, again, enslavement is not something that has just occurred. It's been around for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. But what makes the Atlantic slave trade unique is we're now talking about this becoming much more international and frankly global. So I have a definition of slavery right here. There's a vocab word I think you should know. It's called chattel. Chattel slavery is, there's many different kinds of forms of enslavement, and this one is frankly one of the worst. It's where these humans are literally treated as a commodity. They can be bought and sold. And certain forms of chattel slavery that also will take place in the United States is that someone could be born into slavery, and that was actually a fairly unique version of enslavement. Often, if an enslaved person had a child, they weren't necessarily guaranteed to be a slave, but what makes chattel slavery so particularly bad, especially in the United States, is that they could in fact be born into it. So, again, the idea of enslavement is that it's all about exploiting resources as cheaply as possible. So, it was expensive to buy slaves, as you're going to see next year in United States history, but the ability to use that labor is going to be more efficient than if you paid laborers living wages, things like that. So the Atlantic slave trade here is going to basically be a combination of Europe, Africa, and North and South America, and this intermixing between the two. So Portugal, again, is the first European country to really amp up the international slave trade. So their explorers are going to West Africa, and they are purchasing these enslaved people who were usually prisoners of war between warring tribes in Africa. And that is really the beginning of this international portion of it. So I want you to circle and star this term here. It's called the asiento. So the asiento is it's a Spanish word for the slave trade. And essentially, we're going to see this, whoever controls the slave trade has the asiento. So it's first going to be controlled by really Portugal, but very quickly Spain is going to overtake them and control the asiento. And we're going to see the asiento change hands, as you can see. So it's going to go from Portugal to now Spain, then to the Netherlands, to the English, then well, actually really French and then English. And essentially, whoever controls the asiento controls wealth. They control power. They control the international slave trade. They control a lot of international trade. So the asiento is going to be an extremely valuable piece of economic wealth that European countries will vie for. All right, so I already mentioned the prisoners of war part, and I've already mentioned the whole point of the enslavement is to extract resources as cheaply as possible and make it an efficient process for Europeans to get rich. When enslaved West Africans were sent to North and South America, and they call it the Middle Passage, that part of the Atlantic Ocean, the conditions on those slave ships were absolutely awful. You can read about it right here. At least 2 to 8 million people are killed in that Middle Passage alone. It's actually really tough to figure out the numbers on how many enslaved West Africans died just on that voyage alone. We're not even talking about dying in captivity in West Africa or in North and South America. So put a star in the Middle Passage, just mentioned it. So that's the portion of the triangular trade, which is a diagram on the next slide, where West Africans were enslaved and then transported by whoever controlled the asiento, so let's say the Portuguese or the Spanish, to North and South America. And again, the conditions were absolutely awful. All right, so most enslaved people from Africa were from West Africa. So this is showing you the regions and these kingdoms that were being exploited by Europeans. Oh, all right. So numbers again are tough to narrow down. So right now, current estimates of how many people were enslaved by Europeans and taken to the Americas is in the ballpark of about 12 million. And here's your breakdown on where they were sent. Just over half to South America and about a third-ish to the Caribbean and eventually, of course, North America as well. And again, numbers here, this was actually a little bit more conservative number that I've seen, but we'll just say at least 2 million people were killed on that. Just the voyage alone from West Africa to the Americas. So more information about the treatment. Again, understanding the premise of enslavement is it's all about wealth extraction. Enslaved people were treated as a commodity. A commodity is something that is bought and sold, traded. And again, they're treated as property, not as human beings. So another impact of the Atlantic slave trade is now the Western Hemisphere. North and South America is going to become dramatically more diverse. So you're going to now see an intermixing between Native Americans, white Europeans, and now West Africans. So some people have labeled this the Atlantic slave trade also as an African diaspora. Diaspora means a spreading of people. In this case, it was forcible because it was enslavement. But regardless, though, we're now going to see the influence of West African culture in both North and South America. And think about the long-term impact. North America is one of the most diverse places on Earth. Modern-day Brazil is literally the most diverse country on Earth. The United States is actually fairly close to that as well. So that's where this diversity comes, is from the Atlantic slave trade. Next part is now because Europeans are having more and more contact with people of color, people from other parts of the world, we're now seeing the foundation of what eventually will be labeled as white supremacy. So I've already mentioned the idea of ethnocentrism, how Europeans felt their culture was superior to everyone else's, and now it will be based not just on culture but race. So white Europeans felt that they were simply better than black Africans, than Native Americans. And that really is the foundation of what we'll eventually call white supremacy. So this is a description of how Europeans interacted with people of color, at least the few that were in Europe at that point, although that number will gradually increase. It's another reading of the triangular trade. Again, you're going to see slightly different numbers. It's very difficult to have good estimates of the number of people that were enslaved, sent on the Middle Passage, things like that. Record keeping wasn't exactly perfect back then. Here's your map of triangular trade. So our outward journey starts in Europe, goes to West Africa, usually to purchase enslaved people, and then send them to the Middle Passage to, in this case, the West Indies or the Caribbean. And eventually they will make their way to North America as well, South America as well, and then they can make the return passage. So it's that triangular trade was a form of economics at this time. Okay, so this next set of notes is just going to get into where major European colonizers had their colonial empires. Most of this, I'm just going to say, read on your own. I'm just going to touch upon the major areas that certain countries colonized. So here I have this note saying, from exploration to colonization. Exploration is like the initial contact of European explorers to these uncharted places of the world, at least for Europeans. And now we see colonization, where they're taking Portuguese people and they're now moving to another area of the world, taking it over, calling it their own. That's colonization. Additionally, we can call that imperialism. Imperialism is like economic and political influence over another group of people. So colonization and imperialism often work hand in hand, but they're not exactly the same. Colonization is you're physically taking over the land and putting your own people on it. Imperialism is you are economically and politically exploiting them, taking advantage of them, etc. All right, so for Portugal. For us, I would definitely know the Portuguese colony in Brazil. Additionally, gotta know their coastal colonies in West Africa, Southern Africa as well, some on the east coast of Africa, but basically they had coastal cities. They're not colonizing the interior of Africa. Got Brazil. India as well. India is really going to be important by the 18th century, especially when the French and the British start competing over control of India. And additionally, Portugal will start having an empire in the Spice Islands area as well, but the Dutch will kind of conquer them on that part. Just an FYI, It's a little bit nitpicky, but once we get to King Philip II of Spain, note that officially Portugal was controlled by Spain from the 1580s to just about the end of the 30 Years' War. 30 Years' War ends in 1648. So again, the Spanish crown is really going to control Portugal, and that's one of the reasons why Portugal's colonial empire will be overtaken by other European countries. So the issue with Portugal is they're such a small country, their population is not nearly as large as, say, France, as Spain, as England, and they just don't have the bodies to be as powerful and successful as the other major European colonizers. So Portugal gets replaced pretty quickly, first by Spain, then eventually by France, England, and the Netherlands. All right, so Spain's the big one. Gotta know Spain. We need to know Spain. And additionally, can you write the word New Spain? So when I say South America, like, we're talking about New Spain. I'm talking about North America, we're saying New Spain. So that's what they officially labeled their colonies as in North and South America. Especially, they're the key ones. Also note, they are going to take over some important Pacific islands, notably the Philippines. Eventually, the United States will take that back from Spain during the Spanish-American War in the late 1890s. Eventually, Philippines will become independent in the 20th century. So Spain's going to be a key leader of colonization. And eventually, though, we're going to start seeing the Spanish Empire disintegrating as other European nations will conquer Spanish land. And additionally, starting in like the late 1700s, early 19th century, we're going to see revolts in the Spanish colonies that will lead to independence for, say, Mexico, for Argentina, for Venezuela, etc. All right, so for England, England really is going to get a good start on colonization once we get to Queen Elizabeth I and then also King James I in the early 17th century. So initially, Elizabeth's really kind of like focusing on annoying the Spanish. She was hiring the famous privateers, also known as pirates, to attack Spanish ships, gain some of that gold they were transporting. Then England's going to really start getting a foothold in North America by the very early 17th century. So I have some initial attempts of England trying to create an empire. Newfoundland, frankly, for our purposes in AP Euro, aren't crazy important, but we will know that Canada is going to be an incredibly important colony of England, especially once. This is going to take until the 18th century, but once England is able to kick the French out of Canada, and then England fully controls that. The famous Lost Roanoke colony, I'm sure you studied in 7th grade social studies. For us, you don't really need to know it, except for Sir Walter Raleigh, who was a lover of Queen Elizabeth I. He kind of messed that one up a lot. Anyways, we got to know the next slide, though. Jamestown. Put a little star in Jamestown. That's the first successful English colonial settlement in North America, 1607. I'm sure you have probably heard that date before. And from there, we're going to see England prosper in North America. Additionally, just 12 years after the establishment of Jamestown, that's when the first enslaved people are brought to North America. It's quite literally into Jamestown. And that begins this now over 200-year history of enslavement in North America. There's actually, the New York Times had a project based on that. But that's where the enslavement begins in North America, 1619. So next, we have a few colonies that just be aware of. This really is more for AP United States history next year. But the English are going to create two settlements, the Plymouth Colony obviously being the famous one, founded by a group of English Calvinists, who we call Puritans, who disagreed with the Anglican Church and wanted to establish a much more strict church in the northeast of what eventually we'll call the United States. And eventually, though, the Plymouth Colony is surpassed by what we call the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Same thing, it's run by English Puritans, and this is what really is what's going to found obviously Boston, Salem, really the modern Northeast that we see. They're going to create universities like Harvard, for example. So Massachusetts Bay Colony will really have the longevity there. Okay, Middle American colonies, Southern American colonies, just note what they are producing that's particularly important for Europe. Remember, the whole point of having a colony is extracting the resources. We're talking about cash crops here. Wheat, oats, barley, rye, fruits, timber. Well, it's not really a cash crop, but you get the point. Furs! Don't forget about the warm stuff on the backs of these cute little animals like mink and beavers, guys. So, remember, a lot of parts of Europe get really cold. And then they see these little fluffy, cute animals that make great fur coats. Sorry, guys. It is what it is. Additionally, this is what I love talking about, is timber and, like, shipbuilding. Europe very quickly experiences a problem by, like, the 17th century, is they don't really have that many trees left. So they're cutting down so many trees, building these ships that are sailing the seas, and they're using it to build their homes sometimes. Often they would resort to more stones, which are actually probably better for houses anyways. But when they go to North America, like, one of the first things that, like, made their jaws drop were how many trees were in North America. And that's really going to create this entire shipbuilding and international timber business, because, folks, trees matter. All right, the Southern American colonies are going to be famous, obviously, for tobacco, cotton. Again, sugarcane's always king for a long time. It's the most profitable cash crop to know. All right, keep going here. I want to get caught up in this here. All right, so the West Indies is going to be important for multiple reasons. They're going to be ports, naval bases. The Caribbean is great for growing, once again, sugarcane. And what else we got here? South Asia. So please note, South Asia eventually is what we will call, for example, India. So just make that note, India, South Asia connection here. And what the English will start doing, and eventually we'll call them the British by 1707, is they start giving monopolies to control other regions of the world to these joint stock companies, and most famous being the East India Company. British East India Company eventually, once we have a country called Britain. And they're really going to actually control and monopolize the trade and the political control over South Asia in particular. And then the French actually will do the same thing, and then they're going to compete over South Asia. So again, here's a list of things that the British, or the English, and eventually the British are interested in, and you can see some illicit drugs right there. Yes, there will be a war called the Opium. Actually, there's 2 wars called the Opium Wars. All right, next we have, where am I at? France, here we go. So again, going through this in a more generic sense, you can read the nitty-gritty details on your own. So you're going to see the French really start exploring in, like, the northern portion of North America. Eventually we will call it today Canada. So they're really going to have a lot of settlements in modern day Canada. And eventually they'll call it New France. And now, oh gee, why do people in Quebec today, like Montreal, speak French? There you go. So eventually we're going to see a lot more warfare between France and Britain in the 18th century. Long story short, Britain will win, and they're going to really gain most of France's colonies by the end of the 18th century. Oh, middle part of the 18th century. Okay, so other French colonies to know. Haiti, where are you? Here you are. Circle and star, Saint-Domingue, or today we would of course call it Haiti. Haiti was the most profitable colony in the entire French Empire. And why? Because it was extremely successful at growing sugarcane. There were at least 800,000 enslaved Haitians by a really small number of white French, and they exploited that enslaved labor to use it to produce sugarcane, and that was really the most profitable part of the entire French Empire, until, of course, Haiti successfully revolts by the early 19th century, and we have an independent country called Haiti. So I'm going to talk more about the mercantilist economies I have a bunch of slides on it. So all of this stuff is related to mercantilism, which is you have colonies to extract resources for the benefit of the mother country. So, for example, France has a colony called Saint-Domingue, or Haiti, and they're extracting the natural resource of sugarcane to benefit both politically and economically the mother country, France. All right, so some other sections of the French Empire. Also note, France will have its own joint stock company called the French East India Company that will fight the British East India Company. All right, moving on. The Dutch. So this we'll cover a little bit more later on in other sets of notes. But by the 17th century, mid-17th century, the Dutch will really become one of the most wealthy nations on earth because of their control over the international trade. They're not using, let's say, they're not as focused on like converting people as, say, the Spanish, the Portuguese, and even to a certain extent the English and French. They're all focused on wealth, wealth, wealth. So this wealth acquisition is so prominent that the Netherlands creates its own golden age from that wealth. And unfortunately, a good portion of that wealth is based on a part of their control of the African slave trade. So the Dutch golden age was directly linked to their ability to enslave people. All right, so there's a whole bunch of areas in Southeast Asia, the Pacific Rim that the Netherlands controlled as colonies, notably modern-day Indonesia. They're going to control some tea-making areas, East Asia as well. We get it. Okay. Some other parts. The Dutch are going to get a colony in southern Africa. They're going to call it eventually the Cape Colony. And that's going to start this immigration of white Europeans to southern Africa. Eventually, the British will control this area, and that's going to kind of set the stage for the Boer Wars later in the 19th century. And, of course, the apartheid government that dominated South Africa just after World War II to the early 1990s. So, again, like the impact of colonialism is centuries long. Like, I just made a reference to the early 1990s. So, it starts 15th century, and then the impacts we still feel even today in 2023. Some scurvy. Who doesn't want to talk about scurvy? You can read this on your own. Yum. Let's see here. Oh, Columbian Exchange. Give it a star, please. Star the Columbian Exchange. I know you covered it last year in Global 1, and I'm going to remind you of it right now. So I have a definition from Britannica up here, but as long as you can remember the word exchange, you're probably fine. So it's this exchange of plants, animals, diseases, people, ideas between Europe, Asia, Africa to the Americas and vice versa. So basically the exchange of the old world to the new world, vice versa. So here's just a list of things that are being exchanged. You can read them on your own. Obviously a big portion of this is going to be sugarcane, other cash crops like cocoa, chocolate, potatoes are going to be so stinking important later on. Obviously enslaved people, and of course diseases. Make sure you know smallpox. Make sure you know smallpox. All right, moving on. Some fun little facts about the disputed origins of syphilis, which is a sexually transmitted disease. Okay, put a bajillion stars on all of the slides with the word mercantilism on it. Gotta know mercantilism. It is our first major economic system in this course, and it's ridiculously important. Here we go. And all the versions and parts of mercantilism. All right. Got this. First, here is a definition of mercantilism. A state's power depends on an actual calculable wealth, usually expressed in terms of gold and silver bullion. So if you ever see the word bullion, they explicitly mean the amount of gold and silver in a country. So they want to actually have like hard currency is what they're saying, to show who is wealthy. The way they're going to do that is in multiple fashions. So here now the principles of mercantilism. The goal is get a lot of gold and silver. Here's now how they're going to do it. So number one, they want a state. Remember, I use the word state, I mean country. They want a favorable balance of trade. Keyword here, and you're going to underline it, is favorable. Favorable means it's favorable for that one country. So let me use England, for example. They want to make sure that England, the English government wants to make sure that England is exporting, aka selling, as much stuff as humanly possible, and minimizing what they buy from other countries. So they want to sell more than they buy. That means they make a profit. So one way of making sure you minimize imports is by having a colony where you can exploit natural resources. So the whole point of this system is to make your country extremely wealthy and also self-sufficient, although that's difficult to fully acquire. So here's generally how the use of colonies works. So let's say England has colonies in North America, and they're going to use the raw material of, let's say, cotton production in the American South. They take that resource. They're using enslaved labor as well doing that. They are sending that raw cotton to England, where it can be produced into a finished good, like cotton cloth. Cotton cloth can be spun into clothes. Then they take that finished good, and then guess what? They can sell it back to the people they just essentially stole it from. So that is how you maximize profit. You exploit the natural resource, turn it into something useful, and then sell it back for a profit. That is one major version of mercantilism. So another portion of this is mercantilists hate competition. They're going to grant monopolies. So like, for example, the East India Company for both France and England, they are versions of mercantilism because they had a monopoly over trade and to exploit resources in a region. As I mentioned down here. All right. So here's now the impact. This won't make that much sense right now. This is going to be more chapter 5 material here in Spielvogel. So mercantilism really leads to this idea of a global economic system. Maybe perhaps we call it really early globalization, where now the world is interconnected for better or for worse, and a lot of it is through enslavement, unfortunately. So the people who get really wealthy over this are the countries that sponsor it. So when we talk about the 17th and 18th centuries in Europe, what's the most common form of government? At least in most countries in Europe, it's some version of monarchy, often absolute monarchies, or at least maybe want to be absolute monarchies. I'm kind of alluding to England right now. And the whole point is, if a country gets really wealthy, who does that also benefit? It benefits the monarch. So mercantilism is all about making the monarch look so powerful, so wealthy as well. So I have some examples. Louis XIV, one of the best examples. England under the Stuart kings is a little bit more complicated because I would not call the English monarchy absolute by any means. That will be a major topic in this course. But there are some kings who tried to be. Hint, hint. And of course, Russia is going to have an absolute monarchy under Peter the Great, and then some of his descendants will at least attempt to have a similar amount of influence as good old Petey there. And again, the whole idea is have colonies, benefits the mother country. So what will eventually happen is mercantilism will start getting challenged by the late 18th century. We're going to see some French economists called the physiocrats, a Scottish economist called, Adam Smith, who are going to espouse or argue for this idea that it's actually not like state control over the economy. Actually, a state should take a hands-off or laissez-faire approach to the economy. So basically, mercantilism will eventually and very slowly be replaced by laissez-faire economics of the 19th century, but it's going to take some time. But mercantilism, it's there for a long time, guys. Gotta know mercantilism. All right, so thank you for listening to me in that 3-part series. Hopefully you got some major examples of how Europeans are exploiting natural resources throughout these 3 series, and of course ending with such an important economic concept of mercantilism. So if you don't quite understand mercantilism, really make sure you reread those slides, because it is key. I'll see you later. Bye-bye.